So fellas, since every pay-per-view of 2024 is now complete, I thought I'd go through the best part or the best thing to come from every pay-per-view of 2024, whether it be a certain fighter winning or a certain finish that took place on the card. We've had some pretty good moments throughout the year of 2024, so I'm going to go through each and every pay-per-view, pick out the best moment that came from the card in my opinion, and we'll start off with UFC 297. Quite a weak way to start off the year, but the best moment to come from this card in my opinion was definitely the fight between Dricus du Plessis and Sean Strickland in the main event. Like I said, this was quite a bad card. I mean, we had Mike Mallet getting fraud checked by Neil Magny, which meant nothing for the UFC. We had that terrible title fight co-main event between Pennington and Bueno Silva, which was arguably the worst title fight of 2024. But the main event between Strickland and Dricus du Plessis definitely saved this card. I mean, even the build-up as well, the way they were fighting in the crowds, the press conference, one of the best press conference moments of the year. And the fight delivered. They both went out there and had an absolute war. Sean Strickland usually has this bad habit of hyping up a fight to be a war and then it never delivers. But this one definitely delivered. They were both swinging. Strickland was sticking to the basics. Dricus du Plessis was putting the pressure on, trying to make it a dogfight. And it ended up being basically a 5-round brawl between the two of them. And it all came down to who wanted it more. And it was a super close fight as well, which just showed how much they both put into it. And that's why I'm excited for the rematch between the two of them. I know Chimaev's deserved a title shot and he earns a title shot, but I'm expecting it to be a good fight just like the first one was. So the fight between Dricus du Plessis and Sean Strickland, the fact that it was a really entertaining fight to see and it kicked off a bad card, it was definitely the best thing to come from a bad card. I'd say this fight was definitely the best thing to come from UFC 297. It was just a good fight, and it's fights like this that Strickland sticks to his word. When he goes out there and says he's going to have a war and then has fights like he did against Paulo Costa, no one really cares. But when he hypes it up as it's going to be a war and it ends up like this, ends up being a good performance. UFC 298, the worst thing to come from this card, or the best thing to come from this card, was Robert Whittaker getting back in the winning column. Yeah, Whittaker, he's definitely one of my favourite fighters in the UFC personality-wise. He's just such a nice guy. And coming into this fight, had been finished by Dricus du Plessis in a huge upset. Dricus du Plessis went out there and knocked out Robert Whittaker at UFC 290 and got the win over Robert Whittaker, a guy who it's not really good seeing him lose. And even in the Paulo Costa fight, he nearly got finished in that first round. Costa hit him with a brutal head kick, had him on wobbly legs, and then Whittaker just stuck to the basics, started piecing up Paulo Costa for the rest of the fight and got back in the winning column. It became a top contender again, so it was just good seeing Robert Whittaker get back in the winning column. I know some people thought that Paulo Costa was going to win this fight because obviously Robert Whittaker had this reputation for being a bit chinny. Dricus had just finished him. Costa hits like a truck. But then Robert Whittaker goes out there, survives some adversity early on and gets back in the winning column and cements himself as a top contender again. And then obviously after this fight, he went and knocked out Ikram Aliskerov to make things better. But seeing Whittaker back in the winning column just after his loss to Dricus du Plessis, where we didn't really know where he was going to be, and he put an amazing performance against Paulo Costa, just pieced him up. I'd say it's probably the best moment to come from UFC 298. UFC 299, the best moment to come from this card was Dustin Poirier giving Benoit Saint-Denis a fraud check. Coming into this fight, Benoit Saint-Denis was the new hottest prospect in the lightweight division. It was on an absolute terror of just pure finishes, just came off that knockout over Matt Frevola. And at this point, Dustin Poirier had lost 2 of his last 3. He'd been choked out by Charles Oliveira at UFC, I think it was 269, and he got knocked out by Justin Gaethje. So he wasn't in a great career spot. But then I felt like he was kind of disrespected against Benoit Saint-Denis, not only for the fact that people were completely kind of writing off Dustin Poirier, but Benoit Saint-Denis was ranked number 12, getting a title contender fight against Dustin Poirier, who was ranked number 3. And the amount of people picking Benoit Saint-Denis to win this fight and kind of just disrespecting Dustin Poirier. This was the performance where Dustin Poirier had to remind everyone who he is and what he's done and why he's a legend of the sport. He goes out there and he absolutely chins Benoit Saint-Denis. I think it was the second round, just chins him, follows up with a brutal shot like his Dan Henderson versus Michael Bisping part 2 to put the cherry on top, and gets the win and puts himself back in the winning column, showing that you shouldn't count Dustin Poirier out, especially against a guy that hasn't proven himself. And I'm not one of these people that kind of, you know, crazy nostalgia bias where every single time there's a bit of a veteran or a legend, I always want them to win. But in cases like this where you've got a legend in Dustin Poirier against a guy that should not have been in there with him, and people are disrespecting Poirier, saying that his time's done, and he goes out there and brutally beats Benoit Saint-Denis in that fashion in the co-main event of 299. It was just a great way to well, I guess kick off the card before the main event. So Dustin Poirier knocking out Benoit Saint-Denis, giving him a fraud check, in my opinion, best thing to come from UFC 299. And as we know, it was a fraud check because Benoit Saint-Denis couldn't even perform when he fought Renato Moicano. So I'd say this is the best thing to come from UFC 299. And then UFC 300, I'd argue, the greatest card of the year. The best moment to come from the greatest card of the year has to be the moment between Holloway and Gaethje, that last 10 seconds where they both just started brawling and Holloway knocks him out. And in fact, I'd argue this is the best moment of the year, not only just of the UFC 300, but And this fight had a lot of hype going into it as well, but I feel like it actually exceeded expectations. It was Max Holloway domination. I know Justin Gaethje had his moments, but the majority of the fight was just Max Holloway dominating Justin Gaethje until the last 10 seconds. Points in the middle of the octagon, gives Justin Gaethje a chance, which is just ultimate, you know, something that a BMF would do. They both just start swinging, clocks Justin Gaethje with a big shot and puts him out cold when there's 1 second left to go. And it wasn't even the amazing knockout that made it so good. It was also the fact that it was between Justin Gaethje and Max Holloway on a card like UFC 300, the biggest card of the year, in the featured fight between Holloway and Gaethje, two guys that are known for putting on fun fights. You couldn't have written a better story between the two of them. You couldn't have scripted a better fight. Holloway was an underdog as well to make things better and prove people wrong. So Max Holloway knocking out Justin Gaethje, moment of the year, potentially the most iconic moment in UFC history. Not only of UFC 300, but the entire history of the UFC, just because of the way that Holloway put him to sleep. So the knockout, the occasion, who he was between, the belt, that it was the best BMF belt performance. I don't think you can write a better BMF performance as well in a script. So Max Holloway knocking out Justin Gaethje at UFC 300. I don't know, we had some good moments on that card, but by far, this was the moment that topped it. I remember going into the Zhang Weili fight, and I couldn't even focus on the fight because my adrenaline was so high after this fight. Anyway, UFC 301. The best thing to come from this card was the return of Jose Aldo, coming out of retirement and beating Jonathan Martinez. Coming into this fight, Aldo had that really boring performance against Merab, where Merab essentially just held him against the cage the entire fight. It wasn't a dominating fight from Merab. I don't think he landed a single takedown. Similar to the Mario Batista fight, just held Aldo against the cage, and Aldo retired after this. It was kind of sad to see Aldo, a legend of the sport, go out in such a bad way in a boring fight. And then he decides to come back against Jonathan Martinez in Brazil, Rio de Janeiro, his hometown. And it was vintage Jose Aldo. He was outboxing Jonathan Martinez. He was piecing up on the feet. He looked levels above Jonathan Martinez in this fight, which I didn't really expect. He took him down effortlessly and controlled him in that third round. It was just total domination from Jose Aldo, and he actually looked like a legitimate contender, which nobody expected when he was coming back after 2 years. Back in the winning column in Brazil, in front of his home crowd. It was just a good thing to see from Jose Aldo. A legend like Aldo coming back against a young gun and absolutely piecing him up, battering him as well. The fact that it was in Brazil, the fact that it was... I think this could have been a good retirement. I'm not saying I don't want to see Aldo come back again, but this would have been a good way to retire in front of Brazil after beating Jonathan Martinez. And obviously now he's just had that boring fight against Mario Batista, but this was just a good thing to come from UFC 301. Aldo returning to the octagon, beating Jonathan Martinez, getting a win in Rio, was in my opinion the best thing to come from UFC 301. UFC 302, the worst pay-per-view of the year, was massively carried by the main event, just like UFC 297, and the best part of the card was the fight between Dustin Poirier and Makhachev. It was a complete war. A lot of people thought coming into this fight it was just going to be too one-sided. Makhachev was going to take him down and get the sub early on. Wasn't really going to be a competitive fight. Isn't going to be a dogfight. People think the only people that can be in dogfights are the likes of Gaethje, Poirier, Chandler. Makhachev, he might get a quick finish, but it's not going to be a fun fight. Well, I think they both kind of proved everyone wrong because, I mean, as well, on top of that, like I said, we were coming off that boring fight between Sean Strickland and Paulo Costa and Morono and Price. And then they both go out there and have a scrap. They were both trading on the feet. Makhachev was taking him down and controlling him with the grappling, but Dustin Poirier had solid takedown defense. They were both trading shots in the feet, both basically going out there and brawling, which I don't think anyone expected when you've got Makhachev in the equation against Dustin Poirier. And it was a super fun fight to see until eventually Makhachev gets the finish over Dustin Poirier, puts the cherry on top of the performance and gets the finish in the 5th round. And I feel like they both impressed people. I mean, you've got Islam Makhachev, who was kind of labelled as this boring guy. All Dagestanis are boring. You know, you can't be in a fun fight if it's not involving Gaethje, Chandler or Poirier. And then he kind of turned into a fun fighter. Now the narrative surrounding Islam Makhachev is he's actually a fun fighter. He had a fun fight with Poirier. Before that, he knocked out Volkanovski. So I feel like Makhachev's now kind of hyped up as this fun fighter. And Dustin Poirier, a lot of people saying he gets demolished early on. He has no chance. And even though he still got finished, he did a lot better than people thought. No one really expected Dustin Poirier to make it to round 5 against Islam Makhachev. People thought he was going to get finished early on. So the fact that they both put on an absolute scrap, the fact that Makhachev was willing to stand with Dustin Poirier, and the fact that Poirier lasted as long as he did, I think was the best thing to come from UFC 302, which was, I mean, it's not really hard to make a good moment out of this card when the card was terrible. So Makhachev, Poirier, the war that they had in the main event, the entire build-up of the fight as well, how everyone was rooting behind Dustin Poirier, and the fact that he went out there and did that, I'm going to say that was the best thing to come from UFC 302. UFC 303. I'm going to say the best moment to come from this card were the prospects that were on the prelims. I know the main event between Poatan and Yuri, where Poatan just demolished Yuri, was a good thing, but I actually think the prospects on this card had a lot of prospects. I mean, The main card, like I said, you had a good fight between Porton and Yeri and Brian Ortega and Diego Lopez, but the rest of the main card were pretty terrible. They were all boring fights. None of them lived up. I mean, they didn't really have any hype going into it, and they definitely weren't good fights anyway. But you had some good prospects on the prelims. You had Peyton Talbot, who had a lot of hype after he just demolished Cameron Simon. He was scheduled to fight Yanis Kamori, knocks him out in 13 seconds, gets a pretty quick finish, and gets 10 times more hype than he had coming into it. Then we had Joe Pyfer, who he's been hyped up as like the hardest hitter in the UFC, harder hitting than Ngannou. And even though he had lost to Jack Manson at this moment in time, he had a comeback fight against Marc-Andre Barriault, and he puts him to sleep. Brutally, faced first on the canvas again in a quick time as well of only just over a minute. We also had Gene Silva from the Fighting Nerds compete on this card as an underdog. Goes out there, basically just styles on Charles Jourdain the entire fight until eventually lands a massive uppercut and brutally knocks out Charles Jourdain, who in himself is a good striker. So the prospects that competed on the prelims, specifically Peyton Talbot, Joe Pyfer, and Gene Silva, all of them getting pretty brutal finishes early on in the fight, I think made the card of UFC 303. It was a very prelim-heavy card, which is understandable because they thought, you know, McGregor's going to be in the main event, there's going to be eyes on it, let's hype up these guys, but they all performed, they all passed the check, they all got good finishes, so I'd say the exciting prospects on the prelims of 303 is the best thing to come from this card. Now, UFC 304 in Manchester, the best thing to come from this card was Paddy Pimblett shutting up the fans with a dominant win over Bobby Green. The entire narrative of Paddy Pimblett's entire career was that he was just a loudmouth guy who would get smoked by any ranked fighter. He might be fun in the unranked area of the lightweight division, but the second he faces someone good, he gets smoked. And you look at his past couple of fights, he fights and beats Jared Gordon. Everyone was hating on him. Everyone was saying it was a robbery. You know, he shouldn't have won that fight. He doesn't deserve to be near the rankings. Then he beats Tony Ferguson. Everyone's complaining because he couldn't finish Tony Ferguson. Paddy Pimblett looked too beatable in this fight. Can't finish Ferguson in 2023. And then he fights Bobby Green. The narrative going into this fight was that Bobby Green was going to win. You know, he's got amazing takedown offense. He's going to be able to keep it on the feet. He's got Chris boxing. He's going to outbox Paddy Pimblett. And basically, this is going to be Pimblett's first loss in the UFC. And he's messed up by taking the fight with Bobby Green. And Pimblett brutalized him. He choked him out cold and broke his arm in the same submission. Probably the most brutal finish and probably the best finish as well for UFC 304, which kind of lacked finishes. And the fact that he shut up the fans proved that he's eligible for a ranking spot by becoming ranked. I think he's ranked number 14th now in the division. So the fact that he beat a pretty much a stylistic nightmare in Bobby Green, got into the rankings, shut everyone up, proved that he actually is a top 15 contender in a dangerous division and not just this loudmouth guy. I'd say it was the best thing to come from UFC 304. Definitely the best finish. Pimblett shutting everyone up, getting a finish that brutal as well. It's not even the fact that even the fact that he beat Bobby Green could have been impressive, but even if it had gone to a decision, you know, that would have been impressive. But it's the fact that he finished him so brutally, so early on, before anything could really get going. I'd say it's the best thing to come from UFC 304. And then 305, the best thing to come from this card was the war between Mateus Gamrot and Dan Hooker, in my opinion. Yeah, this was a really good fight because Dan Hooker was such a big underdog coming into this fight. 90% of fans thought that Gamrot was going to win. Hooker was a huge underdog, and rightfully so. Gamrot, he was hyped up as the next big thing in the lightweight division. He came out of taking a loss to Beneil Dariush in 2022, but apart from that, he was kind of running through people in the lightweight division. And Dan Hooker, he was on a 2-fight winning streak, but it was a split decision over Jalin Turner and a win over Claudio Puelles, and before that, he'd lost 4 of his last 5. People thought that Gamrot was just going to take him down and control him in what was going to be a fairly boring fight, but they both put it out there. They both put their heart out there. Dan Hooker returned in amazing fashion. It was landing and kind of piecing up Gamrot on the feet. Gamrot was doing well as well, landing back against Dan Hooker, making it a dogfight, mixing it with the grappling effectively, and it made for fight of the night on UFC 305. One of the best fights this year, in my opinion. And the fact that Dan Hooker, who was an underdog, came back and got the win and got back in the winning column. I'm actually got it back into the top 6 as well. I don't think anyone really expected Dan Hooker to make it back anywhere near the top 5. Especially back in like 2022 when he was getting finished in nearly every single one of his fights. So the fact that Dan Hooker got back in pretty much the top 5, beating Mateus Gamrot, who was kind of hyped up to be the next big thing. Remember, he was a backup for Oliveira and Islam Makhachev, or at least he was supposed to be the backup. So the fact that Dan Hooker was able to beat the prospect in the lightweight division of Mateus Gamrot in an absolute war and an absolute scrap for UFC 305, in my opinion, was definitely the best thing to come from this card. And then UFC 306, it's a pretty easy answer. It's the Sophia. The Sophia was the star of the show, and that was the best thing to come from UFC 306. We've had some decent venues in the UFC. I mean, ranging from the Apex to the T-Mobile Arena to MSG. There's been some good venues, but in my opinion, the Sophia tops all of them. It's been the greatest venue in UFC history. I don't think there's been a single combat sports event, whether it be boxing, MMA, any combat sports event in history that's had a venue just like UFC 306 at the Sophia. It was the greatest venue in combat sports history. It felt like a modern-day gladiator arena. It felt like some sort of movie, in like a high budget movie between two fighters. It didn't feel real. It didn't feel like we were watching the UFC, but I mean that in a good way. The visuals on this, just everything from the officials, the ring girls, the octagon, just everything about the venue for UFC 306, in my opinion, made it amazing. Even just watching the fights, and then you look in the background, and then, they look like they're in the middle of some sort of, I don't even know, like some crazy city with like a drawn angle. I don't know how to explain it, but it just looked crazy. The visuals, everything about this card, because of 306 elevated it. This would have been a really bad pay-per-view if it wasn't for the arena, but the fact that it was like a modern day gladiator arena for the Sophia, and imagine we had like an Alex Pereira fight, or like a big fight between a star like McGregor or whoever you want to say in the Sophia. It would be a massive fight. So I'd say the Sophia itself, UFC 306, the fact that it took place in the greatest venue in UFC history definitely made it what it was. And then for UFC 307, talking of gladiators, the best thing to come from UFC 307 was the main event between Alex Pereira and Khalil Rountree, putting on pretty much a gladiator battle in the main event. Yeah, this had a really bad main card. If you take away Alex Pereira versus Khalil Rountree, the rest of the main card was terrible. I mean, Pennington versus Pena and Aldo versus Batista was boring. Delite versus Holland ended early because of an injury. Ketlen Vieira versus Kayla Harrison was underwhelming. The rest of the main card just wasn't really living up to the hype. It was a bit of a boring main card. Nothing really happened that was significant. Nothing good really happened. But then the main event between Porton and Rountree, it definitely turned up the card. And like I said, we talk about the Sophia being a modern-day gladiator arena. Well, this was a modern-day gladiator battle that could have taken place in a gladiator arena, because that was exactly what it was. Khalil Rountree kind of shocked the world in those first two rounds. Dropped Alex Pereira and was probably doing the better in the fight. I mean, I'd say Rountree was up on the judges' scorecards, and then Porton starts to get back in the matrix, starts piecing up Khalil Rountree, landing some shots, getting in the flow of things, until eventually he lands a massive shot, drops Khalil Rountree after what was a scrap where Khalil Rountree lasted longer than we thought, and got the finish against Khalil Rountree. I'd probably say that this is the best fight of Alex Pereira's light heavyweight career. I know he's had some good fights, he's had some good finishes, but the fact that it was against Khalil Rountree, a guy that was so, durable and tough, he didn't just get knocked out in the first round or two, he actually made it to round 4. The fact that he actually had success early on as well, he actually fired something back at Porton, unlike most light heavyweights. I'd say this is Porton's best light heavyweight fight so far. It was an amazing fight. Even though Rountree lost, his stock massively rose and he proved that it was top 5 potential for the light heavyweight division, whilst Alex Pereira just got another highlight reel finish. So Porton versus Rountree, the gladiator battle between the two of them. It was an amazing fight for UFC 307, and it was definitely the best thing to come from this card. And then for UFC 308, I'd say the best thing to come from this card was Ilia Topuria making history. Now, obviously, it's not good to see Max Holloway lose, but I think if you look at it from an Ilia Topuria perspective and just how much history he made in his last 2 fights alone, and I'd say this is one of the most hyped up fights of all time as well, which just made this fight even better. I think it's definitely the most hyped up fight of 2024, just because of what they had coming into it. You got Ilia Topuria, who just knocked out Alexander Volkanovski, first guy to beat Volk in the featherweight division. You've got Max Holloway, who just knocked out Gaethje at UFC 300, best moment of the year, and was on a 3-fight winning streak. This fight had everything. It was one of the most hyped up title fights of all time. It was a fairly 50-50 fight as well. It wasn't like there was a huge favourite going into it. You've got Max Holloway, who's the UFC's greatest chin, never been knocked out in his entire MMA career. You've got Ilia Topuria, who went out there and just knocked out Max Holloway for the first time in Holloway's career. The first guy in MMA history to knock out Max Holloway in any division, any time. Just first guy to knock out Max Holloway, making history. That was just crazy, and Topuria made himself a superstar in this fight. It was already a big star going into it because of his Volkanovski knockout, but this made him a superstar, and it's still crazy to me how, when you really think of it, this guy knocked out Volkanovski and Max Holloway back-to-back. Imagine telling someone back in 2022, when Volk was the champion and Holloway was number 1, that there was going to be a guy to come in the featherweight division, knock both of these guys out early on in the fight, back-to-back. Nobody would have believed you. Topuria made history. He made himself a superstar. He made himself featherweight's biggest star, a pound-for-pound top 5 fighter, whatever you want to say. He made history, because if Topuria never knocked out Max Holloway probably would have got his entire MMA career without even getting knocked out, or I guess dropped, if you even want to go as far to say that. So Topuria made history. First guy to knock out Max Holloway. It was crazy to see. And then for UFC 309, I'd say the best thing about this card was Charles Oliveira getting back in the winning column. Yeah, I mean, Oliveira's got to be one of my favourite fighters, from his personality alone and the fact that he's just such a likeable guy. But more importantly, his fighting style. He's got such dangerous jiu-jitsu. He's dangerous on the feet. Everywhere the fight goes, he's dangerous. He's one of the most exciting fighters. And before this, he'd had that fight with Arman Tsarukyan at UFC 300 where he lost. It was a really razor-close fight, but he lost the fight. And it wasn't even the fact that he lost to Tsarukyan in a close fight that was irritating. It was the fact that he kind of got pushed away from the title picture. The entire narrative after the Tsarukyan fight was that the title run is over for Charles Oliveira. He's just lost to Tsarukyan. Never mind Makhachev. The title run is over. And then he fights Michael Chandler at UFC 309. And he was amazing. I mean, he was beating Michael Chandler on the feet, nearly finished him on the feet early on in the fight. He was doing better with the wrestling, which really surprised me. He was taking down Michael Chandler, dominating with the wrestling, had his back for the majority of the fight, threatening submissions. He completely dominated Michael Chandler and got back in the winning column at the end of it. And I'm going to go as far to say that this is the best Charles Oliveira we've ever seen. This is purely the best Oliveira we've seen, just because of the wrestling that he had as well. Before, he was a dangerous striker who had good jiu-jitsu, but he didn't really have the wrestling to back it up. But in this fight, it seems like he's been working on his wrestling, vintage Charles Oliveira, and he's put himself straight back into the title picture. Unless Topuria moves up to the lightweight division and faces Charles Oliveira, I don't mind Oliveira getting a title fight against the winner of Makhachev and Strickland. I really don't. I think he's earned that now. So Charles Oliveira getting back in the winning column by beating Michael Chandler, in my opinion, was the best thing to come from UFC 309. And I'm not a massive Michael Chandler hater, but it was kind of satisfying to see a guy in Michael Chandler who was gifted a big fight and consistently cheated through the entire fight get beaten in the way that he did against Charles Oliveira in pure domination. So Oliveira getting back in the winning column at UFC 309 was my favorite thing to come to this card. And then the final pay-per-view, UFC 310, my favorite thing about this fight, about this card, was Pantoja finally getting the respect he deserves. Pantoja had to be one of the most disrespected champions coming into this. I mean, he had that fight with Brandon Moreno where he won the belt, but the entire narrative in that fight wasn't even the fact that Pantoja won. It was more of the fact that Moreno lost and Moreno's going to be back. Then he faces Roy Val, where no one really cared about this. No one was showing Pantoja the respect. People calling it a boring fight. I mean, Buckley's Octagon interview from 10 hours ago already has more views than Pantoja's fight from Brandon Royval a year ago, which kind of just shows how disrespected Pantoja was. And then he gets his fight with Steve Erceg, which already had outrages over the main event and the fact that the flyweight was going to be main event in a pay-per-view. He has a very close fight with Steve Erceg, gets the win. Everyone's complaining, saying it's a robbery, and he shouldn't have won the fight. And even in his home country, the crowd are leaving during the Octagon interview, just showing how disrespectful the Brazilians are. And even after this, Pantoja was still pound for pound number 11 only, after he'd cleared out the entirety of the flyweight division and beaten everybody. And then he gets scheduled to fight Kaya Sakura, you know, this new big Japanese star entering the UFC, and he goes out there and finishes Sakura in 2 rounds. Pretty much dominated Asakura the entire fight, dropped him in the first, controlled him, and then got the submission and choked him out cold in the second round. And I feel like now, finally, after UFC 310, people are finally starting to respect Pantoja. People are saying he should be pound for pound top 5. People are hyping up this fight with Demetrius Johnson, and I don't think most people are going to mind if we see more kind of pay-per-view main events between Pantoja, because even though the flyweight division, it's not the most popular division, I feel like because of how dominant Pantoja is, and he's on the same level as like Volkanovski was back in his prime, and, you know, Kamaru Usman in the welterweight division. That is what Pantoja's going through right now, but no one's really paying attention because it's the flyweight division. But when you really break it down, he's one of the best in the world, definitely pound for pound top 5. So Pantoja finally getting the respect he deserves after beating Kaya Sakura at UFC 310 is the best thing to come from that card. But that, in my opinion, is the best thing to come from every UFC pay-per-view of the year. Let me know if you agree, disagree, if you change anything around. Let me know your thoughts. Thank you for watching.